A 25-year-old woman signed a piece of paper in a small-town attorney's office in upstate New York, and everyone in the room believed she had just accepted the worst thing a family could give: 45 acres of steep, neglected hillside with no running water, no paved road, and a wooden house that hadn't been lived in for nearly 30 years. Her aunt sat across the table with a smile that carried more pity than warmth, more relief than kindness. Her two cousins flipped through their own documents with the comfortable distraction of people who already know what they're getting. And the young woman clicked her pen shut, slid the paper back across the desk, and said nothing. What none of them knew, what not a single person in that room understood, was that she had already read something they would never see: a document hidden for 5 years by a man who loved her enough to wait. And what that document described would change everything. Before we go further, if stories like this one, stories about patience and inheritance and the things we almost throw away, if they mean something to you, take a moment and subscribe. It helps us keep telling them. Now let's go back to where this began. The attorney's office was on the second floor of a limestone building on Main Street in a town called Geneva, New York, one of those Finger Lakes towns where the buildings remember more than the people do. The hallway smelled of floor wax and old paper, and something faintly mineral, the way old stone buildings smell when the heat runs too long in autumn. There were 3 framed photographs on the wall outside the conference room, black and white prints of the town in the 1920s, and Clara Merritt glanced at them as she walked in, not because she cared about local history at that particular moment, but because looking at anything was easier than looking at the people already seated inside. The conference table was dark walnut, scratched at the edges, with a glass pitcher of water in the center that no one had touched. At the head sat Mr. Caldwell, the attorney, a man in his late 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a tie that looked like it had been chosen without enthusiasm. He had been Alice Merritt's personal attorney for over 25 years, and he had the demeanor of someone who had seen enough family meetings to know exactly when things were about to go wrong. Lorraine Goss sat to his left, closest to the window. She was Clara's aunt, her grandfather's younger daughter, and she had the particular posture of a woman who had already decided how this meeting should end. Shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, hands folded on the table in front of her with the fingers interlaced. The rings on her right hand caught the overhead light every time she moved, which she did infrequently and with precision. Beside her sat her 2 sons. Trent, the older one, 31, with a jaw that seemed designed for expressing mild superiority, and Calvin, 28, who was looking at his phone under the table with the half-attention of someone who believed his presence was a formality. Clara's mother, Judith Merritt, sat at the far end of the table near the door, as if she had chosen the seat that would make leaving easiest. She was 53, with dark hair pulled back, and the particular expression she wore when she wanted to be somewhere else, which was most of the time when family was involved. She had not looked at Clara since they arrived, not out of cruelty, out of something closer to helplessness the inability to say the right thing, which had over the years become the decision to say nothing at all. Mr. Caldwell opened a folder, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. The estate of Alice Andrew Merritt was not enormous, but it was substantial enough to produce exactly the kind of tension that families manage to contain for years until someone dies and the container breaks open. There was the Lakeview Farm, 120 acres of flat productive land on the western shore of Seneca Lake, with a renovated farmhouse, modern equipment, and a lease agreement with a regional cooperative that deposited payment on the first business day of every month. There was a portfolio of rental properties, 2 apartments in Geneva, and a commercial space near the college, all occupied, all generating steady income. There were financial instruments, mutual funds, and certificates of deposit conservatively managed, totaling just over $600,000. And there was the Stoneridge property. 45 acres of hillside in a place called Stoneridge Hollow, 22 miles from the nearest town by unpaved road. A wooden house built in the 1950s that had not been occupied in decades. A barn with half its roof missing the sheets of corrugated metal stacked against the outside wall by someone who had promised to come back and never did. A septic system that was, generously speaking, an architectural suggestion best avoided in warm weather. In an access road that turned, in the wet seasons of spring and autumn, into a river of clay-colored mud that challenged vehicles with four-wheel drive and defeated everything else. No one had appraised the property, no one had ordered a survey. The only consensus among the Merritts was that the Stoneridge land was worth little cost more to maintain than it returned, and that whoever received it was in effect receiving the family's acknowledgement that their share of the inheritance was the smallest. Mr. Caldwell read the allocations without inflection. Trent received the Lakeview Farm. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when reality confirms what he already believed he deserved. Calvin received the rental properties. He looked up from his phone long enough to sign, and then went back to the screen. Lorraine received the financial portfolio, the $600,000, which she accepted with the particular grace of someone who had expected exactly this and had already decided how to spend the first portion. Judith received $40,000 in a separate savings account that Alice had maintained in her name. It was by any measure the least, but Judith had never asked for more, and had long ago stopped expecting anything from the family that resembled fairness. She signed without reading, and Clara received Stoneridge. Lorraine waited until Mr. Caldwell left the room to retrieve additional copies. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was long enough for Lorraine to compose the sentence she had probably been composing since the reading began. Her voice came in that precise frequency that wounds without sounding aggressive, the frequency of a woman who has practiced her cruelty until it passes for concern. "Well, it's exactly what you deserve, sweetheart." It was not said with anger, it was said with certainty. And that was worse, Clara finished signing the last page. She kept the pen, placed it on the table, and waited for Mr. Caldwell to return. She did not cry, she did not respond. She did what she had learned to do since she was 16 years old, when she realized that not every fight takes place on level ground. She put the feeling somewhere it could not be reached by anyone else, and she waited. Because what Lorraine did not know, what Trent and Calvin and Judith did not know, what no one in that room could have imagined, was that Clara had already spoken to Mr. Caldwell 3 days earlier. He had called her at her apartment in Syracuse, where she had been living for the past year and a half, working at a small construction firm that specialized in residential renovations. He had asked her to come in privately before the family reading, and she had. In that private meeting, in the same conference room, with the same scratch walnut table, Mr. Caldwell had placed in front of her a document she had never seen. It was a soil analysis conducted 5 years prior by a licensed agricultural engineer named Dr. Howard Pennell, commissioned and paid for by Ellis Merritt himself. No other family member knew it existed. Ellis had arranged it alone in the quiet way he handled things he considered too important for family discussion. The analysis was 12 pages long, with maps and soil composition charts and photographs of rock outcroppings taken on the steep eastern face of the Stoneridge hillside. Clara had read it twice in that office slowly, with Mr. Caldwell sitting patiently across from her, and then she had read the conclusion a third time. The conditions of hydric and thermal stress observed on this slope, combined with dite mineral composition of the basaltic substrate, present potential comparable to recognized quality terroir for the production of high-expression wines, particularly long-cycle varieties, with demand for thermal amplitude. She did not fully understand the technical language the first time through, but she understood enough. She understood that the land her family considered worthless had been quietly, professionally assessed as exceptional, not for farming, not for development, for something older and more specific, for growing grapes, attached to the analysis paper clipped to the final page in Ellis's own handwriting, irregular and slanted and perfectly legible, was a single note. She'll know what to do. Clara had sat in that chair for a long time after reading. Mr. Caldwell had not rushed her. He had, in fact, poured her a glass of water from the same pitcher that now sat untouched on the table, and had said only one thing. "Your grandfather spent a long time thinking about this, Clara. A very long time." She had folded the document, placed it in her bag, and carried it with her into the family reading 3 days later. It was in her bag now under the table, while Lorraine said what she said, and Trent nodded, and Calvin scrolled, and Judith looked away. She signed because she knew what they did not, and she let them believe what they needed to believe, because correcting them would have cost energy. She was already saving for something else. To understand why Clara signed that paper, why she accepted what appeared to be the family's discard without protest or collapse, it is necessary to go back. Not far. Just far enough to see who she was before that attorney's office, before that autumn, before the day an old man would appear at the door of a house that creaked in the rain, carrying a pot of coffee and an observation that would change everything. Clara was born in 1999 in a hospital in Syracuse, the daughter of Judith Merritt and a man named Dale Fenton, who was present for the first 4 years of her life and then became increasingly intermittent the way fog lifts between the Finger Lakes hills without announcement or apology, until one morning it is simply gone. Judith raised her daughter with the help of her parents Alice and Hattie Merritt, who lived in a clapboard house outside Geneva with a garden of hydrangeas in front and a large backyard where Alice grew tomatoes, lettuce, and an entire row of Concord grapevines that produced more than any family could reasonably consume. It was at Alice's house that Clara spent most of her school vacations between the ages of 5 and 12. Hattie died when Clara was 8, a stroke that came fast and left faster, and Alice grew quiet for a period that Clara understood at the time as sadness but recognized years later as real grief, that silent reorganization a person undergoes when they lose the half of themselves that made the whole make sense. After the grief settled, Alice became more present with his granddaughter, not in an effusive way, not with excessive hugs or weekly gifts, but in a substantive way. He taught, he showed. When he walked through the backyard, he would point at the soil and say things that Clara recorded in her mind without knowing why. That good soil is not the soil that looks prettiest, it is the soil that holds the right moisture. That soil with too much clay suffocates the root. That plants that suffer a little develop deeper roots than plants that grow easy. She was 11 years old when he took her to Stoneridge for the first time. It was September, the end of a warm Finger Lakes summer, and the hillside was green with an intensity that happens only when the August rains have soaked everything deep and the September sun begins to dry with restraint. Alice parked the car on a side road, stepped out slowly and stood looking at the steep slope covered in dense secondary growth, with an expression that Clara could not name at the time, but recognized years later as the expression of someone who sees what others cannot see. Your grandmother loved this place. That was all he said. They stood there for perhaps 10 minutes in silence. Then they got back in the car. Clara grew up. She finished high school with decent grades. She tried the entrance exam for a civil engineering program and did not pass. She tried again, passed on the second attempt for a construction technology certificate at a community college. She completed the program. She worked for 2 years at a small architectural firm in Geneva, then moved to Syracuse, worked at another firm, did not enjoy the atmosphere. She tried starting a small renovation business with a friend named Bridget, and the business survived 14 months before closing, not because of lack of work, but because of a partnership that had more friendship than clarity about money. During this time, her cousins, Trent and Calvin, graduated from business and law programs, respectively. They married women the family approved of. They bought houses. They had children on schedules the family considered appropriate. Clara fell behind on that invisible ruler that families keep, the one that measures not happiness, not character, not intelligence but compliance with the expected script. When Alice became ill at 78 with a prostate cancer that moved slowly at first and then accelerated without warning, Clara was the one who spent weeks visiting him in the hospital. The cousins came on weekends when they could. Lorraine coordinated care by telephone with administrative efficiency, but without the physical presence that old people need. Judith went, but left distressed, and soon returned home, because witnessing her father's deterioration was unbearable in a way she could not articulate. Clara stayed. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat in silence. On an afternoon in January, with the hospital artificially heated and heavy snow falling outside the window, Alice took her hand and said more to himself than to her words that she would carry with her through everything that came after. Some people inherit what's already been done. Some people inherit what's still going to be. She asked what he meant. He smiled and closed his eyes, not because he was sleeping, but because he had said what he needed to say. Alice died on a Thursday morning in February, with the room quiet and the window open to the hospital courtyard, where the snow was still falling. Clara was not present at the exact moment. She had left at 6 in the morning to get coffee for the overnight attendant. When she returned, he was already gone. She stood in the doorway for a long time, the cup still warm in her hands, looking at the man who appeared more peaceful than he had been in years. The estate process began 2 months later, and with it what had been a family of silent tensions and resentments stored in well-locked drawers became something more explicit. Clara was not expected at the initial meeting with the attorney when the division was announced. She learned about it through details, through messages in the family group chat, through side comments that reached her the way rumors reach a person who has been excluded from the original conversation. When she was finally called to sign, the division had already been decided, approved by the others, and no one had asked her opinion about anything. The first week at Stoneridge was the hardest week of Clara Merritt's life, up to that point. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in May with a used pickup truck, a Chevy S10, that Bridget had helped her find on an online listing, loaded with everything she owned that fit. A backpack of clothes, an air mattress, a pot, a cutting board, a knife, 2 pillows, a portable phone charger, a headlamp, a box of groceries for 1 week. The dirt road was dry that afternoon. She would learn later that this was a blessing of limited duration. The house smelled of damp wood and moss growing between the floorboard gaps and the specific silence of a place that has been closed too long. Not a silence of peace, but a silence of abandonment, which has a different texture entirely. She opened every window. She walked through the rooms, 2 small bedrooms, a living room that was also the kitchen, a bathroom with 1970s tile in faded green. The wood stove was in the kitchen, black with old soot, and she tried to light it that afternoon using the firewood stacked outside, which was half damp, and she spent 40 minutes producing smoke without flame before finally coaxing a coal that held long enough to heat water for pasta. She ate alone at the kitchen table, with the evening falling fast outside and the dense woods around the house producing sounds she could not yet identify. Her phone had intermittent signal, sometimes 1 bar, sometimes nothing. She called Bridget. "I'm here." Bridget's voice came through with static. "How is it?" "A lot to fix." "But are you okay?" Clara looked through the window at the complete darkness that had swallowed the hillside. In Syracuse, there was always light somewhere. Here it was real dark. The kind of dark that only exists where there is no town nearby. "I'm in one piece," which was different from okay, but it was what she had. In the first 2 weeks, she inventoried the property. She walked every acre with a notebook and a pen, recording everything she saw. The secondary forest had reclaimed much of the upper terrain. In the lower section, near the creek that cut through the back of the property, there was an open area that had been brush cut at some point, perhaps a year before, perhaps less. The soil was exposed there, and she could see its color clearly, a reddish-brown with pieces of dark rock breaking through at multiple points, the basaltic substrate the engineer's report had described. She photographed everything with her phone and sent the images to Mr. Caldwell, asking if there was additional documentation about the property beyond what he had already shared. He said he would check. In the third week it rained. It rained for 4 consecutive days. A persistent Finger Lakes rain that is not spectacular or dramatic. It is simply continuous, stubborn, patient in its saturation of everything. The dirt road became what Clara had been warned it would become. She was trapped. The pickup truck had no chance of climbing or descending through the clay. She stayed in the house with enough firewood for the stove, enough groceries for maybe 5 more days, listening to the rain on the metal roof and the sound of the creek, which had swollen considerably. It was during this week that she began to feel the weight of what she had chosen in a way that the animation of the first days had masked. The phone had no signal during the rain. She could not reach Bridget, could not check her email. She was alone in a wooden house on a hillside that no one visited, that no one had tended for years, that her entire family had considered a discard. On the night of the third day of rain, she sat on the living room floor with her back against the wall and thought for the first time with genuine seriousness about the possibility that she had been wrong, not about signing the inheritance papers, about believing she could do something with this. She was 25 years old. She knew construction. She knew a little about structural calculations. She knew nothing about viticulture. She knew nothing about grapes. She knew nothing about wine, except that she liked drinking it, which was a laughably insufficient foundation for anything that could be called a plan. She went to her backpack, opened the inner pocket, and took out the folded report. She read it again. She read the phrase about the terroir. She read the word exceptional. She read Alice's handwritten note that she had found paper-clipped to the final page. She'll know what to do. She read a second note written on the back of an envelope tucked inside the report. that she had discovered only after leaving Mr. Caldwell's office. Clara will understand what this means when she gets there. She always understood what others couldn't see. She folded the paper, put it back in the pocket, and waited for the rain to stop. The rain stopped on a Tuesday morning, with the sun that came out hesitant at first, and then committed, illuminating the wet hillside with the clean light that exists only after a long soaking. Clara went down to the creek, washed her face in the cold water, and on her way back to the house she noticed something she had seen before but had not yet investigated. On the opposite side of the hollow on a property she had noted existed but had not approached. A thin line of smoke was rising from a chimney. Neighbors. She had not encountered any neighbors. The nearest property was nearly a mile and a half away, based on what she had estimated from the land survey map. But the smoke was there, and she needed to speak with someone who knew this region. She crossed her property on foot along the lower path, passed through a gate of rotting wood that separated the two parcels, and climbed the internal stone-gravel road until she reached a house smaller than hers, lowered to the ground with stone walls and old plaster, a chicken coop on one side and a vegetable garden organized in raised wooden beds beneath the kitchen window. A man was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. He was somewhere around 75 or 80, the age that the Finger Lakes sometimes preserves well, because the cold air and the physical work produce a certain hardness that is not aging but solidity. White hair cut short, large hands with crooked fingers that suggested decades of manual labor, and eyes of a very light gray that looked at her with the calm of a person who is rarely surprised. "You're the one who got Stoneridge?" It was not a question. "I am. Clara Merritt. I know who you are. Your grandfather told me about you." His name was Harlan Casella. He was 77 years old. He had been born in this same hollow, the son of Italian immigrants who arrived in the Finger Lakes at the turn of the century and planted grapes from the beginning because it was the only thing they knew how to do. His father had worked alongside Ellis's family for a period in the 50s and 60s when the Stoneridge property was still active. Harlan had watched the decline of the hillside. He had witnessed the era when the Merritt family abandoned viticulture on the property to pursue other endeavors. He had watched the forest grow over what had once been the best vineyard soil in the hollow. His voice carried the cadence of a man who had spent most of his life talking to plants and animals, and only occasionally to people, which gave his words a weight that conversation-practiced people rarely achieve. "You know that Hillside used to make the best wine in the county, right?" Clara said. She knew roughly that she had read a technical report. Harlan made a sound with his mouth that was not exactly a laugh, but contained something of affectionate irony. "Technical report, that's one thing, but what's on that slope goes beyond any report," he told her. It took over an hour. She sat listening with the coffee cup in her hands, the hillside opening before them in the morning sun. The vineyard at Stoneridge had been established in 1918 by Ellis's great-grandfather, an immigrant named Agostino Merritt, who had brought cuttings of Concord and Isabella from a property near Hammondsport where he had worked when he first arrived. Agostino chose that specific slope because the soil was poor and rocky. Against the common wisdom of the time, he had learned from an old Italian winemaker that poor soil forces the vine to deepen its roots, to work harder, to concentrate more sugar and aroma in its clusters. The vine suffers a little, but it produces less and better. Poor soil makes deep roots. It was the first time Clara heard the phrase spoken aloud, though she had sensed its meaning in everything Ellis had ever taught her in his backyard in Geneva, pointing at dirt and saying things she filed away without knowing why. The vineyard thrived for decades. In the 30s and 40s, Stoneridge produced wine that was sold to restaurants in Geneva and even to buyers in Rochester and Albany. It was not refined wine in the modern sense, but it was wine with personality, wine that buyers recognized by its mineral flavor and the specific acidity of that basaltic soil. Ellis had abandoned the vineyard in the late 70s when his own father died, and he needed to manage other responsibilities. And when the wine market was undergoing a transformation, he lacked the capital or the will to follow. The vines were gradually covered by the forest. The barn deteriorated. The house fell out of use. But the oldest vines, Harlan said, leaning forward slightly in his chair, the ones with root systems 50, 60, maybe 70 years deep in that basalt, they had not died. They were still there, on the upper slope, buried under brush and secondary growth, dormant but alive. Harlan knew this because he had walked the property several times over the years with Ellis's quiet permission, and he had seen the old trunks still standing. "Your grandfather didn't leave you that land by accident." Harlan's coffee had gone cold in his hand, but he had not noticed. "He left it because he knew you'd have the patience to listen to what the soil is telling you." Clara was quiet for a moment. The morning sun had fully cleared the ridge, and the hollow was bright now, the wet ground steaming faintly. "Can you help me understand what it's telling?" Harlan looked at her for a span that felt longer than it was. Then he set the cup down on the porch railing. "Come tomorrow, early." What Harlan showed her the next morning changed everything. They entered the forest on the upper part of the property with a brush blade that he handled with surgical precision, opening a path without wasting a single stroke. Clara followed behind with her notebook and her headlamp, even though it was daytime, because under the close canopy the light was dim and uncertain. Every 50 or 100 feet they found remnants of rusted wire, the old trellis lines that had once guided the vines into the correct position for sun exposure. And the vines were there. Not all of them. Many had been permanently overtaken by the forest, but a core of them Harlan estimated as they worked through the slope perhaps 300 to 400 linear feet of rows, with vines spaced roughly 3 feet apart, had survived. The plants were tangled with wild grape and creeper vine with thick trunks of irregular bark tendrils, growing in every direction without guidance. But the roots were deep in that basaltic soil. and they were alive. Harlan pointed to different trunks, with the same quiet knowledge of a man recognizing old acquaintances in a crowd: Isabella, Concord, the two oldest American varieties, resistant, adapted. These here have got roots deeper than anything you'll find planted new today. Clara placed her hand on the trunk of one of the oldest vines. The bark was rough-layered, with the specific texture of something that has endured decades of winter and summer freeze and thaw neglect and patience. The plant had a physical presence she did not expect. It did not feel abandoned. It felt like it had been waiting. "Can they be brought back?" she asked. "Depends on what you mean by brought back." Harlan ran his hand along a lateral branch, feeling the nodes with his fingertips. "If you want fruit next season, no. If you want them producing well in a few years with work and patience, yes." Years? It was a word that fit poorly in the horizon of a 25-year-old. But she had learned from Ellis in those mornings in the Geneva backyard that certain things only happen in their own time, that poor soil does not lose what it is, that the deepest roots belong to the plants that were never given an easy season. She looked at the vine under her hand, at the hillside opening through the trees, at the old man standing beside her with 70 years of knowledge in his crooked fingers. "Teach me," she said. Harlan adjusted his hat, looked at the vine, then at her, then at the slope falling away below them toward the hollow and the lake beyond, where the morning light was catching the water in a line of silver that seemed to go on without end. "Tomorrow, early." Clara nodded. She kept her hand on the vine for one more moment. The bark was warm where the sun had reached it through a gap in the canopy. Below the bark, below the wood, below the soil, the roots were reaching into stone that had been there for longer than any family, any argument, any inheritance could measure. Poor soil. Deep roots. She was beginning to understand what her grandfather had always known. She had a great deal of work to do. Harlan came the next morning at 6:15. Clara heard his boots on the gravel path before she saw him, and by the time she stepped onto the porch, he was already standing at the edge of the tree line, with the brush blade resting on his shoulder, looking up the slope, the way a surgeon looks at a patient before the first incision. He did not say good morning. He said, "Bring gloves." She did not own work gloves. She brought a pair of wool mittens that had been in her bag since Syracuse, and Harlan looked at them for 2 full seconds before pulling a spare pair of leather gloves from his back pocket and handing them to her without comment. The gloves were too large. They smelled of soil and something faintly resinous. She wore them every day for the next 3 months until the leather molded to her hands and the smell became indistinguishable from her own. The first task was clearing. Not the dramatic clearing of felling trees, but the painstaking work of removing the secondary growth from around the surviving vines without damaging the plants themselves. Wild grape had wound itself around the old trunks in patterns that mimicked the cultivated vines so closely that Clara cut the wrong stem 3 times on the first morning. Each time Harlan stopped her with a raised hand and pointed to the difference, the texture of the bark, the direction of the tendrils, the way the cultivated vines would, had a density that the wild grape lacked. "Feel it," he said the third time, guiding her hand to two adjacent stems. "The old one is heavier. It's been building that wood for 60 years. The wild one grew in 2 seasons. You can feel the difference if you stop looking and start touching." She learned to feel the difference. It took a week. The physical toll was immediate and comprehensive. Clara had done construction work, had carried materials and operated tools, and spent full days on job sites. But agricultural labor on a steep hillside used the body differently. The slope itself was the first adversary. Every step required ankle stabilization that flat ground never demanded. By the end of the second day, her calves burned with a specific deep ache, and by the end of the first week, her lower back had developed a persistent complaint that woke her at 5 every morning, regardless of when she had gone to sleep. Her hands were the worst. Even with the leather gloves, the brush blade and the hoe, and the constant gripping of vine trunks while clearing, produced blisters that opened and bled and opened again before they could heal. She wrapped them in medical tape from a first aid kit she had bought at a gas station on her way to the property, and the tape soaked through with fluid by mid-afternoon. She described the situation to Bridget during one of their evening phone calls, standing on the one spot near the northwest corner of the house where the signal sometimes held for a full conversation. "It's the kind of pain you feel in muscles you didn't know you had." Bridget listened. She did not say stop, she did not say slow down, she did not offer advice Clara had not requested. She asked how the sunsets looked from the hillside, and Clara, who had not thought about sunsets in weeks because she was usually too tired by dusk to notice anything except the distance between where she stood and the bed, paused and looked west toward the lake, and saw that the light was in fact extraordinary. "There's something," she said. "Good. You need at least one thing that doesn't hurt." Harlan's method of teaching was consistent. He appeared 3 or 4 mornings a week, always early, always with a specific task. He taught with his hands on the plant, never with abstraction. He showed Clara how to identify the previous year's fruiting canes, distinguishable from new growth by the color and texture of the bark, because it is on the previous year's wood that the buds are positioned to produce fruit in the coming season. He showed her winter pruning, how many nodes to leaves, where to cut at what angle, so the wound would shed water instead of collecting it and rotting. He showed her how to read the soil by digging a small hole with a trowel and examining the layers, the dark topsoil giving way to the reddish clay, giving way to the fractured basalt below, and how the depth at which the roots hit stone determined the mineral character of whatever those roots would eventually feed. He never praised her. He corrected her when she was wrong, acknowledged when she was right with a small nod, and moved on to the next thing. It was the most efficient form of education Clara had ever experienced, and it carried an implicit respect that she valued more than encouragement. He treated her as someone capable of learning, which was different from treating her as someone who needed to be taught. At night, with the phone charging on the portable solar panel she had bought during her second week, Clara researched viticulture, enology, the history of Isabella and Concord grapes in the northeastern United States, the rediscovery of American heritage varietals by a new generation of winemakers who had grown tired of trying to replicate Burgundy and Bordeaux on American soil and had begun asking a different question. Not how do we make wine that tastes like France, but what does wine taste like when it tastes like here? She found articles, academic papers, interviews with small producers in the Finger Lakes and the Hudson Valley who were working with exactly the grapes that grew on her hillside. Producers who had discovered that Isabella, long dismissed as a table grape unfit for serious winemaking, could produce wines of startling acidity and mineral complexity when grown in the right conditions, when the soil was poor, when the roots went deep, when the vine was forced to work for what it produced. The information accumulated. The calluses on her hands thickened. The two processes felt related. She rebuilt the barn roof in July with the help of a man named Virgil Toomey, a local builder from the nearest town who Harlan had recommended, with the specific endorsement of, "He won't cheat you and he won't talk too much." Virgil was in his mid-50s with a gray beard and an economy of movement that suggested a lifetime of knowing exactly which effort was necessary and which was waste. He arrived on a Monday with a truck full of corrugated metal sheeting and a teenage nephew who carried materials without being asked. Virgil looked at the barn stone walls the way a reader looks at a well-written sentence. He ran his hand along the mortar joints, examined the corners, peered at the foundation where it met the hillside. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. He said it with the quiet seriousness of a man recognizing craftsmanship across a span of decades. The walls are sound. It's just the roof that gave up. The roof took 2.5 weeks. It was a simple structure, but it was sufficient. A processing space with temperature reasonably controlled by the thickness of the stone walls, where Clara would be able to handle her first harvest when it came, if it came. There was still a great deal of uncertainty between the present tense and that future verb. When Virgil finished, Clara paid him from the diminishing reserve of savings she had brought with her. $18,000, the accumulation of years of restrained living in Syracuse. The number had been shrinking steadily since her arrival. Barn materials, vine tools, trellis wire, groceries, gas. The mathematics of starting from nothing did not allow for optimism, only for careful allocation. She applied for a small loan at a bank in Geneva, $12,000, using the Stoneridge deed as collateral. The loan officer, a woman about her mother's age, looked at the property description with an expression that suggested she was approving the loan more out of procedural obligation than confidence. Clara signed the papers with the same pen she had used in Mr. Caldwell's office, and she noticed as she signed that her handwriting had changed slightly. It was steadier now. The letters were smaller and more compressed, as though her hand had learned to conserve space the way the rest of her life had learned to conserve everything else. The house she repaired on her own board by board in the intervals between vineyard work. She replaced the rotted hallway floor with reclaimed wood she bought from a salvage dealer near Watkins Glen, old-growth lumber harder than anything manufactured new, with a scent of time that new wood does not possess. She recaulked the windows. She replaced the ceiling boards where water infiltration had softened the wood to pulp. She painted the interior walls with whitewash, which brightened the rooms in a way she had not anticipated. The house became beautiful, not beautiful in the way of expensive renovations or magazine spreads, beautiful in the way of an honest thing that has been repaired with care. It was during the house repairs that something began to happen in the community that Clara did not expect and did not initiate. A woman from town, someone she had spoken to exactly once at the hardware store, drove up the dirt road on a Wednesday afternoon with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil and a jar of pickled vegetables. She handed them to Clara on the porch, said, "Harlan mentioned you were up here working," and left before Clara could fully formulate a thank you. 2 days later, the man who ran the gas station in town refused to charge her for a can of kerosene. He rang it up, looked at the total, deleted it, and said, "Harlan's people are my people." Clara did not know what to do with this sentence, so she nodded and took the kerosene. At the Saturday farmers' market in the town square, where Clara had begun selling vegetables from the garden she had planted, in the sunniest patch near the house, lettuce, arugula, tomatoes, scallions, zucchini. The other vendors made space for her table without being asked. A woman who sold honey gave her a jar and told her to put it on her biscuits. A man who sold firewood told her he would deliver a cord to Stoneridge at cost whenever she needed it. No one made a speech about it. No one organized a welcome committee. It was simply the quiet, cumulative generosity of a small community, recognizing someone who was doing honest work and deciding without discussion to help. Clara sold out her vegetables in under 2 hours the first Saturday. She drove back to Stoneridge with $230 and the knowledge that she needed to plant more. August came with the task that Harlan had been preparing her for since the beginning, the first recovery pruning of the old vines. This was the most delicate operation in the entire restoration process. The vines had grown free for decades with branches extending in every direction, and they needed to be reduced to a structure that could be trained onto the rebuilt trellis system. A wrong cut would kill what had survived. They worked for 3 consecutive days. Harlan indicated, Clara cut. Both evaluated. At certain moments he said, "No, leave that one," with a certainty she did not question. There was a knowledge in those hands that came from 70 years of observation, a knowledge that no textbook compressed into equivalent form. At the end of the 3rd day, with the vines pruned and their true architecture revealed, thick trunks and lateral arms, marking decades of growth, the vegetable memory of generations. Deposited in that dark wood, Harlan stood looking at the result for a long time. His voice came low, almost private. Your grandfather would have liked to see this. Clara had something in her eyes at that moment. Wind or rust or something else that was not crying, but had the same effect. She wiped her face with the back of her glove and looked at the old vine nearest her, its trunk now visible in its entirety for the first time in decades, twisted and scarred and utterly alive. She had rebuilt the trellis wires over the following 3 weeks, straining the wire along the entire length of the vine rows with a wire tensioner and a vocabulary of new profanity that the work extracted from her involuntarily. Her arms ached in places she could map on an anatomical chart by feel alone, but the vines were growing in an organized manner for the first time in a human lifetime. She had planted during that first winter 600 new Isabella cuttings and 300 Concord purchased from a certified nursery near Hammondsport that Harlan had recommended. These young plants would not produce for at least 2 or 3 years. Young vines need time to establish root before being asked for fruit, but they were the extension of what had survived the continuation of the project beyond the first harvest. It was in mid-September, while she was clearing the room in the house that had served as a storage space for decades, removing debris to make room for a small office she wanted to set up, that Clara found beneath a pile of folded canvas tarps a wooden box. Inside the box, wrapped in plastic bags to protect against moisture, were papers, letters, handwritten letters from Clara Merritt, written in the irregular, slanted penmanship she recognized from the grocery lists he used to write on sticky notes in the kitchen of the Geneva house. The letters were dated across several years. The oldest was from 2015. The most recent was from 2022, 3 months before he died. They were letters to her. They had never been sent. They were stored there as if he had known she would come to find them. Clara sat on the floor of that room with the box in her lap and read for 2 hours while the afternoon light moved across the floorboards she had replaced, and the sound of the creak came through the open window. The letters told her things he had never said aloud. They told her about the original Vineyard, about Agostino, about the years of production he had witnessed as a child, about the decision to abandon the vines which had weighed on him for decades, not because it was an obvious economic mistake, but because there was something in that hillside that he felt he was leaving untended, something that deserved better than neglect. They told her about Dr. Pennell, the agricultural engineer he had quietly hired in 2018 to conduct the soil analysis that no other family member knew existed. And they told her across several letters, with a clarity that only emerges when someone writes without an audience, why he had chosen her. In a letter dated June 2019, his handwriting still firm and evenly spaced, he had written, "You are the only grandchild who truly listened to me. The others hear in order to respond. You hear in order to understand. that makes all the difference when it comes to land. Land doesn't ask for quick answers. It asks to be heard. In a letter from 2021, I know the family will think I gave you the worst share. Let them think that. Sometimes the best thing you can give someone is a thing that has to be discovered, not a thing that's already been made. And in the final letter dated January 2022, written in a handwriting more tremulous than the earlier ones, the letters shaking slightly as though the hand that formed them was arguing with its own fatigue. The soil on that hillside went decades without anyone who knew what was there, but it didn't lose what it is. Good soil doesn't lose. You don't lose either. You're like that hillside, Clara, stronger for having struggled, richer underneath than you appear on the surface. She sat with the last letter in her hand for a long time. The light had shifted from the floor to the wall and was now beginning to leave the room entirely, the slow withdrawal of a September afternoon. She could hear a bird outside that she had learned to identify over the months, a wood thrush, its song spiraling downward through the trees in a pattern that sounded, if she was being honest, like someone trying to say something important in a language that was almost but not quite comprehensible. She folded the letter carefully. She placed it with the others. She put the box on the shelf of the bedroom she was rebuilding. There was work to do. She planted the winter cover crop in the vineyard rows in late September, a mix of crimson clover and winter rye that Harlan had suggested to protect the soil and fix nitrogen during the cold months. She ordered dormant spray materials for the old vines, a sulfur-lime solution that would protect against fungal disease through the winter. She began reading about vinification equipment, comparing prices in online forums and Facebook groups dedicated to small-scale winemaking. Communities she had discovered during her first winter on the property and that had become an unexpected source of horizontal knowledge. Small producers exchanging real experience without academic filter. October arrived with the event she had read about, but had not yet experienced. She woke at 4 in the morning with a cold that was different from the habitual cold of the Finger Lakes autumn that she had come to know and had learned to dress for. This was frost cold, dry, crystalline, windless, with the sky completely open to stars, which is the clearest indication that there is no cloud cover to retain the earth's heat. She went out to the hillside with her headlamp and the garden thermometer that Harlan had given her. 27 degrees Fahrenheit, -3 Celsius. The new buds on the vines, the buds that had emerged after the summer pruning, the buds that represented the first visible promise of what all these months of work might eventually produce, were covered in a white crystal that looked beautiful in the lamplight and was devastating. She stood on the hillside at 4 in the morning, with her rubber boots on the frozen ground, looking at months of labor being burned before her eyes by an enemy that made no sound and left no mark except death. The frost did not discriminate between the buds she had coaxed into existence through careful pruning and the weeds along the path. It took everything equally, with the indifferent efficiency of a force that has no opinion about what it destroys. There was nothing to do She did not have frost cloth. She did not have a sprinkler system that could coat the buds in protective ice. She did not have smudge pots. She had read about all of these methods during her nights of study. None of them were available at 4 in the morning on this hillside at this moment. She stood there for a time that she did not measure. Then she went back to the house, made coffee on the wood stove, sat at the kitchen table, looked at the stove. The fire she had learned to build in under 10 minutes. The most reliable object in her new life. The one thing that did exactly what it was supposed to do every time without failure or surprise. She picked up the phone and called Harlan. It was barely 5. He answered on the second ring as if he had been waiting. "Frost," she said, a brief silence. "Then I know 26 at my place." "The buds. I know." He said it again, the repetition carrying not indifference, but the weight of a man who has heard this sentence in different voices across 7 decades of growing seasons. "Come over this morning." When she arrived at 7, Harlan had already walked his own property and assessed his damage. He had frost protection on his vines, decades of experience producing anticipation rather than mere reaction, and his losses were minimal. For Stoneridge, he knew the situation would be different. They walked the rows together in the early morning light, which was sharp and cold and carried no comfort. Harlan touched the frozen buds with his fingertips, evaluating with a tactile sense she did not yet possess. He examined vine after vine, moving slowly, saying nothing. Then he stopped at one of the oldest trunks, the ones in the highest section, the vines with roots that reach deepest into the basalt. "Not everything," he straightened up. "The oldest vines, the ones with the deepest roots, these have reserve buds. If the primary was killed, the secondary can push. It'll be a smaller crop, but it's not zero." Clara breathed. The cold morning air entered her lungs with the specific harshness of a Finger Lakes dawn after frost air that felt less like atmosphere and more like a substance with edges. How much smaller? Depends on how many secondary buds develop. Maybe half of what it would have been, maybe less. Half of a harvest that was still the first from vines that were still in recovery from a production that was still experimental in years away from any commercial scale. Half of that was almost symbolic in terms of volume, but it was real. And sometimes real is enough to keep going. The weeks after the frost were quiet in the way that recovery is quiet. Clara did what needed to be done. She cleared the dead buds. She adjusted the pruning to redirect the vine's energy toward the secondary growth. She consulted with Harlan on each decision, but made the cuts herself because the learning was in the doing and they both knew it. November brought the second blow. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday in a plain white envelope with the bank's logo in the corner. The kind of envelope that never contains good news. The $12,000 loan she had taken against the property was behind on its second payment. The letter used phrases like delinquency notice and collateral review and remediation timeline that Clara read with the particular attention of someone who understands that certain words, when printed on bank letterhead, carry consequences that spoken words do not. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the notebook, where she tracked her finances, a small composition book with columns drawn in pencil, income on the left, expenses on the right, and the balance at the bottom that had been trending in one direction for months. The farmer's market income was real, but modest. $200 a week during the season, nothing during winter. The barn roof, the vine supplies, the trellis wire, the nursery stock, the tools, the loan payments, the food, the gas. The mathematics did not add up. They had never added up. She had been operating on the margin between what she had and what she needed, and the margin had finally closed. She did not panic. She called the bank the next morning and spoke with the loan officer, explained the situation with the directness she had learned from Harlan, no embellishment, no excuses, just the facts of what she was building and the timeline of when it might begin to generate income that mattered. The loan officer listened and said she would see what she could do about extending the payment schedule. It was not a solution, it was a delay. But delays, Clara was learning, were sometimes the most valuable currency available. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon when the light was already leaving the hollow, by 4 o'clock Clara heard a car on the road. She recognized the sound before she saw it. Her mother's sedan, a beige Toyota that Judith had driven for over a decade, appeared around the last bend of the dirt road with the careful slowness of a vehicle whose driver was not confident about the surface beneath her wheels. Judith parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a full minute before getting out. Clara watched from the kitchen window. Her mother was wearing a coat that was too thin for the Finger Lakes in November and shoes that were designed for pavement. She looked at the house at the porch with its new railing, at the hillside beyond, at the barn with its rebuilt roof, and her expression carried something that Clara could not immediately categorize. Not disapproval exactly, something closer to bewilderment. The look of someone standing at the edge of a language she does not speak, wanting to understand but lacking the vocabulary. Clara opened the door. Judith climbed the porch steps. They hugged. It was brief and slightly awkward, the hug of two people who love each other but have lost the habit of expressing it physically. Judith's coat smelled of the car heater and the faint floral perfume she had worn for as long as Clara could remember. They sat at the kitchen table. Clara made coffee on the wood stove, and Judith watched the process with the fascinated uncertainty of a woman who had never operated a wood stove and could not quite believe her daughter had learned to. The conversation was careful at first. How was the drive? When did she leave? Had she eaten? The preliminary architecture of two people circling the thing they actually needed to discuss. Then Judith looked out the window at the hillside, at the bare vine rows visible in the gray November light, at the dirt road that was already beginning to soften with the first hint of the coming wet season, and she said what she had driven 3 hours to say. "Sweetheart, your father loved you very much." She paused, corrected herself. Your grandfather loved you very much, and I know this place meant something to him. But this isn't a life, Clara. You're 25 years old. You could sell this property, come back to Syracuse, find work, start over properly. You have skills, you have your whole future." The words hung in the kitchen like smoke from the wood stove, visible and gradually dispersing. Clara looked at her mother, at the thin coat, at the shoes designed for pavement, at the hands wrapped around the coffee mug with a tightness that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the difficulty of saying things you believe are true to someone you suspect will not agree. She thought about the letters in the box on the bedroom shelf, about Ellis writing in his shaking January handwriting that sometimes the best thing you can give someone is a thing that has to be discovered. She thought about the reserve buds on the old vines, the secondary growth pushing through after the frost killed the primary. The backup plan that the roots had been holding in reserve deep in the basalt, waiting for exactly this kind of emergency. Her voice was steady when she spoke, and she was aware, as she heard herself, that it was steadier than it had ever been, not louder, not harder, just settled, the way a foundation is settled after it has borne weight long enough to know what it can hold. "This is starting over properly, Mom." Judith looked at her. The bewilderment was still there, but beneath it for a moment so brief that Clara almost missed it. There was something else, something that might have been recognition, the faintest flash of a woman seeing in her daughter's face an expression she had seen once before, decades ago, in the face of her own father, standing on a hillside, looking at something no one else could see. The moment passed. Judith finished her coffee. She said she should get back before dark. They hugged again at the car, and this time the hug lasted slightly longer, as though Judith's arms were trying to say something her words had failed to. Clara stood on the porch and watched the beige Toyota climb the dirt road until it disappeared around the bend. The dust settled slowly in the cold air. The hollow was very quiet. She went back inside. She sat by the wood stove. She opened the box of letters and found the one from 2022, the last one, the one with the trembling handwriting. She read the sentence she needed to read. "Good soil doesn't lose what it is. Neither do you." She folded the letter. She put it back in the box. She closed the box. She sat for a while in the warmth of the stove in the house she had repaired with her own hands on the hillside, that her family had discarded and that she had chosen, and she did not cry, and she did not waver, and she did not call anyone. She waited for morning the way the vines waited for spring, with everything that mattered held deep below the surface, where the frost could not reach. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall on the hillside. It covered the pruned vines, the trellis wires, the garden beds, the barn roof, the dirt road. It covered everything equally, without preference, the way silence covers a house when there is no one left to argue with. Clara watched it through the window for a long time. Then she went to bed. There was work to do tomorrow. There was always work to do tomorrow, and for the first time since the frost, since the bank letter, since her mother's thin coat and careful words, that thought did not feel like a burden. It felt like a root reaching deeper. The snow melted in March with a slowness that felt deliberate, as though the land were negotiating the terms of its own return. Clara spent the final weeks of winter in the barn, organizing the equipment she had been accumulating since autumn. A manual grape crusher, purchased second-hand from a retired producer near Hammondsport. A basket press she found through one of the wine-making forums, shipped from a farm in the Hudson Valley, arriving in a crate that smelled of oak and old fruit. Carboys. Fermentation locks. A hydrometer. A refractometer she learned to calibrate by watching a video on her phone 17 times, pausing and rewinding until the process moved from her screen into her hands. She had visited 2 small wineries in Keuka Lake during the winter, driving the pickup through roads that were barely roads to watch the production process in person. Both winemakers had welcomed her with a generosity that continued to surprise her. One of them, a man in his 60s who had been making wine from hybrid grapes for 20 years, spent an entire afternoon showing her his cellar and answering questions she had written in her notebook the night before. When she told him about the old vines on her hillside, about the basalt, about the depth of root, he stopped what he was doing and looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize. "How old did you say those vines are?" "Some of them may be 80 years, maybe more." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the particular awe of someone who understands exactly what that means. Old vines with established roots in deep mineral soil were not a commodity that could be purchased or manufactured. They were the result of time, which was the one ingredient no amount of money or expertise could substitute. Spring arrived on the hillside with an authority that winter had lacked. The secondary buds on the old vines pushed through in April later than primary growth would have been, but vigorous. The reserve energy stored in those deep root systems, energy that had been accumulating in basalt-fed silence for decades, expressed itself in shoots that were thick and healthy and oriented upward with a determination that Clara found against her better judgment moving. She was not the kind of person who attributed emotion to plants, but standing in the vineyard on an April morning, watching growth emerge from wood that everyone, including herself, had nearly given up on it, was difficult to maintain strict objectivity. The 600 young Isabella cuttings and 300 Concord she had planted the previous winter had survived at a rate of about 80%, which Harlan told her was better than average. They would not fruit this year or next. They were establishing root, sending their first tentative filaments into the rocky soil, beginning the slow process of becoming what they would eventually be. Clara found herself checking on them with a frequency that bordered on parental, walking the new rows in the early morning to inspect each plant, adjusting the ties on the trellis wire, pulling weeds from the base of the stems with a care that her blistered hands of a year ago would not have been capable of. The farmer's market resumed in May, and Clara expanded her garden to meet the demand she had established the previous season. She added herbs to the rotation, basil and thyme and rosemary, and a row of flowers, zinnias and sunflowers, that she sold in small bundles wrapped in brown paper. The flower bundles were Bridget's suggestion, offered during one of their phone calls with the casual brilliance of someone who understood retail instinct without ever having studied it. They sold faster than the vegetables. The bank accepted a restructured payment plan in June. The loan officer called to inform her, and Clara detected in the woman's voice something that had not been there during their previous conversations. Not warmth exactly, interest, the particular attention of someone who has revised an initial assessment. Bridget visited for the first time on a weekend in early July. She slept in the guest room that Clara had finished rehabilitating in spring, with walls of fresh whitewash and a window that opened directly onto the vineyard. They cooked dinner together on the wood stove, a skill that Bridget approached with the experimental enthusiasm of someone who has never cooked without electricity. They walked the hillside in the long summer evening, and Bridget stopped at the edge of the old vine section and stood looking at the rows for a long time without speaking. The trellised vines, the cleared understory, the dark trunks with their new season's growth trained along the wires in orderly green lines where there had been nothing but forest and neglect. You did all this, me and Harlan, but you did it. I did. Bridget was quiet a moment longer, then turned to her with an expression that carried something Clara had not seen directed at herself before. Not admiration, exactly. Recognition, the look of a person seeing someone they have known for years and realizing with the gentle shock of a shifted perspective that they had not fully seen them until now. You seem different. Different how? Firmer, more inside yourself. Clara did not respond. She picked a leaf from one of the young vines and held it up to the fading light, translucent, green-veined with darker lines, the vascular architecture of a living thing visible through the thin tissue. The first real harvest came in September of the second year. It was small, far smaller than a commercial operation would consider viable, but it was actual fruit from actual vines, growing in actual soil. Clara picked by hand with Harlan Virgil and a young man from the area named Owen, who had appeared one Sunday morning asking about work and who turned out to have completed a basic viticulture course out of personal interest. Owen was 22, quiet in the specific way of young men who have not yet learned that silence is a skill rather than a deficiency, and he worked with a physical efficiency that impressed even Harlan. They harvested over 3 days. The clusters from the old vines were small and tight, with berries that were darker and more concentrated than Clara had expected. Harlan held one up to the light and examined it with his fingertips, pressing gently, evaluating sugar content by feel, in the way he evaluated everything through contact rather than instrument. "These have been waiting a long time to do this," he said, and it was the closest thing to sentiment she had ever heard from him. The vinification was, for lack of a better word, an experiment. She processed the grapes in the rebuilt barn with the equipment she had spent a year assembling, following protocols she had studied for 2 years before having fruit to work with. 8 50-liter containers. Manual crushing, natural yeast fermentation, because the old vines carried on their skins a microbial population that was itself a product of decades of adaptation to that specific hillside. The result was wine that Clara described to herself as technically correct, but without personality yet. Sound, but not speaking. A first sentence properly constructed that had not yet found its voice. The second harvest the following September was different, not in scale, still small, still manual, still a family-sized operation expanded by 2 extra days of help from Virgil and Owen, different in result. The wine from the second vintage had something the first had lacked, an acidity that was not sharp but present the way a statement of fact is present without aggression but without apology, a scent of wet stone and dark fruit that accumulated in the glass over time, revealing itself in layers rather than announcing itself at once. Harlan tasted the first sample, drawn directly from the barrel, on a cold October afternoon, standing in the barn with his coat still on and his breath visible in the unheated air. He held the glass for a long time. He smelled it. He tasted it. He stood completely still. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, and there was something in it that Clara had never heard before. Not emotion, exactly. Memory, the sound of a man hearing through the medium of fermented grape juice a voice he had not heard in decades. Reminds me of my father's. Clara poured her own glass. The liquid was deep red, with violet edges, the color of something that has been built slowly from the inside out. She looked at it for a while. 3 years of work. A frost, a bank letter, hands with new calluses, nights of study, letters an old man hid beneath a tarp for her to find when she was ready. She drank. It was good. Genuinely, undeniably good. Not in a way that required explanation or context or the indulgence of knowing the backstory. Good in the immediate way that the tongue understands before the mind catches up. That night was the hardest of the entire process. Not because something had gone wrong, because something had gone right. There is a specific vertigo that occurs when the thing you have wagered everything on crosses from possibility into fact. The mind does not quite know what to do with the absence of the problem it had organized itself around. Clara woke at 3 in the morning in the dark of the house, in the silence of the hollow, in the cold of an October night, filtered through windows that closed properly now, but still admitted the particular air of altitude. She lay looking at the ceiling she had rebuilt, smelling the wood and the whitewash, thinking about things she had not allowed herself to think about during the days when thinking would have been a luxury the work could not afford. She thought about the quiet courage that no one makes speeches about. The kind that consists of continuing to do what needs to be done without any guarantee that it will work. She thought about her mother's thin coat and careful words, about Lorraine's voice in the attorney's office calibrated to wound without leaving a mark, about Alice writing letters he never sent to a granddaughter he trusted with the one thing he considered too important to explain. She did not sleep, she did not resolve anything. She lay in the dark and felt the weight of all of it, the accumulated mass of 3 years of solitude and effort and doubt and discovery, and she waited for the day to arrive. The day always arrives. It arrived that morning with a low fog that wrapped the hillside and gave the vineyard the appearance of something not entirely real. Dark silhouettes against white diffusion, the clusters of the coming vintage already visible, when the fog shifted. Clara made coffee, stood on the porch she had extended with salvaged timber, and looked at what she had built. It was hers, it was her work, it was her root. The article came out 2 months later. A journalist named Constance Vale, who wrote for a regional magazine specializing in artisanal wines and small producers, had heard about Stoneridge through Dr. Lenore Birch, a professor of enology at a college near Geneva, who had visited the property at Clara's invitation during the second year and had spent an entire afternoon walking the slope and asking questions that revealed deep expertise. Dr. Birch had mentioned Clara to a colleague who mentioned her to Constance through the informal network of people who pay attention to things that are quietly remarkable. Constance arrived on a Thursday in January, a woman in her early 40s with the particular attentiveness of someone who practices journalism as vocation rather than assignment. She listened, she took notes, she asked questions that showed she had researched the Finger Lakes wine region extensively before arriving. She walked the hillside with Clara in the winter light, touched the old vine trunks, examined the bark. How old are these? The oldest over 80 years. Some might be closer to 90. In the barn, Clara poured the second vintage. Constance held the glass, inhaled, tasted, and was silent for a moment, with the expression of someone confirming a technical observation. This has terroir, acidity. You can taste the soil. That's exactly what it is. Basalt with rock outcroppings. Poor soil that forces the roots deep. Did you study enology? I learned from my neighbor and 2 years of reading at night. Constance looked at her for a moment, recalibrating something. The article ran 4 pages, photographs of the hillside in winter, like the old vine trunks, the restored house, the barn, with its hand-lettered sign. The title read, "The Hillside Nobody Wanted." The subtitle, "How a Young Woman Inherited the Family's Discarded Lot and Found One of the Most Singular Terroirs in the Finger Lakes." The article was shared by several wine-focused accounts with significant followings, and within a week, Clara's email, which she had included at the end of the piece, began receiving messages from restaurants asking about availability, distributors wanting to talk wine, enthusiasts requesting visits. She did not have the volume to fill half the inquiries. The Stoneridge production was artisanal, small by definition and by choice. There was no capacity to quintuple overnight. But there was a waiting list. There was real demand for a real product. And there was, for the first time since she had arrived on this hillside, with an air mattress and a headlamp. the mathematical probability that the numbers in her composition notebook might eventually move in the other direction. Before the article, before any of those emails, Dr. Birch had entered Clara's wine in a regional artisanal wine fair in Geneva with Clara's permission, but without much ceremony. The fair had evaluation categories for traditional variety wines produced by micro-producers, judged by a panel of enologists, sommeliers, and specialized journalists. Clara attended with 2 cases, 24 bottles, and a rented table in the exhibitor area. She knew almost no one. The other producers had in most cases years or decades of experience, established wineries, recognized labels. She was a 27-year-old woman with a Hillside and a story still being written. The awards were announced at the end of the second day. She was not paying particular attention until she heard the name Stoneridge. Honorable mention in the category Terroir Wines with regional identity for Stoneridge Red. Artisanal Harvest Isabella and Concord Varietal Stoneridge Hollow Finger Lakes. She walked to the front to collect the certificate with a composure that surprised her. There was no euphoria, there was confirmation. They were different things. Dr. Birch found her afterward, still holding the certificate. "Did you know you'd win?" "No, but I knew the wine was good." Dr. Birch smiled. "That's the most honest thing I've ever heard at one of these events." On a morning in the following September, with the sun still strong enough to warm the porch boards by 9 o'clock, Clara heard a car on the road, not a car she recognized. A black SUV descended the dirt road which she had gravelled with the proceeds from the first sold lot with more caution than confidence, the driving pattern of someone unaccustomed to unpaved surfaces. The car stopped in the yard. From the driver's side, Trent stepped out. He was wearing clothes that belonged in a different setting, a linen shirt, pressed trousers, shoes that would not survive the first puddle. He stood looking at the house for a moment, at the expanded porch with its dark reclaimed wood and the planters Clara had hung from the columns filled with herbs and wild flowers, at the barn with the sign that Virgil had carved into a plank of black walnut at his own initiative without being asked, the word Stoneridge Vineyard in letters that looked like they had always been there. At the hillside beyond, where the vineyard was now visible in ordered rows climbing the upper slope, the old vines and the young ones together trained on wire that caught the morning light in thin silver lines. Clara did not go to meet him. She remained on the porch. Trent walked to the base of the steps. He looked up at her. "You read the article?" he asked. "I was in it." A silence. Trent looked around again slowly, the way a person looks at a place they are seeing for the first time, despite having known of its existence their entire life. "When we signed those papers," he spoke slowly, choosing each word, "I thought, I know what you thought." Another silence. He put his hands in his pockets, then took them out. "I brought something." He went back to the car and returned with a bottle from the back seat. It was a bottle of Stoneridge Red. He had bought it through the website Clara had set up for the waiting list. "Would you sign it?" It was a request so small and so large at the same time that Clara felt something shift in her chest. a tectonic adjustment in the geography of a resentment she had been carrying so long it had become part of the landscape. She descended the steps, took the bottle, went inside for the permanent marker she kept in the kitchen drawer, and signed in the small, irregular handwriting she had inherited from Ellis, the letters compressed and slanted and perfectly legible. She added the vintage year beneath her name. She handed the bottle back. Trent looked at the signature for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, and it carried nothing performative, no rehearsal, no calculation. Just the simple weight of a man saying something he has only recently understood. Grandpa knew what he was doing. It was not an apology. It was a recognition, the only form of reconciliation that mattered, not words of formal regret, but the honest act of seeing. Clara nodded. "Want some coffee?" He said yes. They sat on the porch for nearly an hour. They did not talk about the inheritance. They did not mention Lorraine. They talked about Alice, about memories that each of them held, that the other had never heard, the way grandchildren of the same person can carry entirely different versions of the same man and both be right. Before he left, Trent mentioned that he had found in a box of old photographs at the Lakeview farmhouse a black and white print that he had kept without understanding what it was. A photograph of a hillside covered in grapevines in full vigor, with two men in hats standing between the rows facing the camera, with the solemn expressions of an era when being photographed was an event. The older man was Agostino Merritt. The younger one, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, was Alice. Clara asked him to send it. He sent it that afternoon before he reached the highway. She stood in the vineyard at the end of that September day, in the low sun that stretched long shadows between the rows, with the clusters of the coming harvest already visible, small and compact, and carrying in their tight dark skins the compressed promise of everything the soil had spent decades preparing. The scent of the hillside at this hour had layers she had learned to identify over the years. The mineral smell of exposed earth where the hoe had passed recently, the green of new shoots, the faint sourness of natural fermentation from fallen grape skins decomposing between the rows and returning nutrients to the ground. She crouched at the base of one of the oldest vines, one that Harlan had identified as being possibly from Agostino's original planting. The trunk was as thick as an adult arm, twisted like wood that grew without guidance for decades before being trained. Beneath the rough bark lay winters and summers, beyond counting frost and heat, drought and rain, all of it building the root system that reached 15-20 feet below the surface, into cold, wet rock where the minerals that gave the wine its unreplicable sense of place were present in concentrations that no technical addition could reproduce. She looked at the photograph on her phone one more time. Two men in hats on a hillside. One who planted. One who remembered. And now, one who came back. The house was lit below the solar panels she had installed in the second year, giving the porch a warm glow visible from any point on the slope. The barn was closed, the containers for the new vintage already prepared, the dirt road gravelled, now usable in more months than before. 45 acres that an entire family had looked at and seen discard, that one woman had looked at and seen a promise that needed patience to reveal itself. The Stoneridge Red went out that year with the label that Owen had designed, discovering in himself a facility with ink and lettering that no one, least of all Owen, had suspected. A simple drawing of the hillside seen from below the vine rows, climbing in perspective toward the top of the slope, and there, near the upper edge, almost vanishing into the margin of the paper, the silhouettes of two men in hats, copied from a black and white photograph that had traveled from a box at a farmhouse to a phone screen to a wine label, crossing a century without losing what it meant. Agostino and Ellis returned to the land that had always been theirs and hers. The hillside had waited for her. She had waited for the hillside. Sometimes that is how inheritances work, not as gifts but as correspondences, things that need to find the right person at the right moment to reveal what they have always been. The soil was still poor, the wine was still rich, the roots were still deep. Clara stood on the slope until the light was gone. Then she walked down to the house, built a fire in the wood stove, and made dinner. There was work to do in the morning. There was always work to do in the morning. And that she understood now was not a sentence about burden. It was a sentence about belonging. Have you ever inherited something, a place, a skill, a piece of advice that didn't make sense at first? Something that only revealed its value years later, after you had changed enough to understand what it was? We'd love to hear about it in the comments. We read every one. Thank you for spending this evening with Clara. Good night.